Franklin Miller gripped the phone tightly, the sound of his son's voice still echoing in his mind. "Dad, this is for your own good." The words sounded like a final verdict as Franklin looked out the window at the garden where every flower was a living memory of his wife, Evelyn. Outside, the wind swayed the violets they had planted together, and Franklin felt the crushing weight of loneliness intensifying. He knew that something was about to happen, something that would change everything forever, and he feared that this time there would be no turning back. The struggle of a father against the greed of his children, a story of overcoming, hope, and renewal. Franklin Miller was in his garden, surrounded by the flowers that he and his late wife, Evelyn, had planted over the decades. Each vibrant color reminded him of a shared moment, a smile, a laugh. Now those colors seemed faded in Franklin's eyes, who spent his days in the solitude of his home in Springfield. The departure of his children, John and Diana, to other cities and Evelyn's death had left a huge void, difficult to fill. The garden, which once was a place of life and joy, had become a silent refuge where Franklin got lost in nostalgic memories. He spent hours tending to the plants, talking to them as if they were his only companions. The red roses brought to mind their wedding anniversaries. The yellow daisies reminded him of sunny days with the little children running around, and the violets. Ah, the violets. Evelyn's favorite flowers. He could still see her smile when they planted the first violets together all those years ago. Franklin maintained a simple and meticulous routine. He woke up early, had breakfast alone at the large dining table where once the laughter of his children filled the space. Then he would go to the garden, where he spent most of the day. However, even surrounded by the beauty of the garden, Franklin could not escape the suffocating sense of loneliness. He waited every day for a call from John or Diana, a visit perhaps. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and the phone remained silent. Time, which once seemed to fly when he was with his family, now dragged painfully. Franklin lived in the hope that one day his children would return home, that the garden would once again be what it used to be. But deep down, he knew that the life he once knew had changed forever. Looking at the violets, Franklin closed his eyes and, for the 1,000th time, wished that Evelyn were still there with him, sharing that silent garden. Franklin's phone rang in the early afternoon, a sound he almost didn't recognize due to its rarity. He was in the living room, sitting in his worn armchair, watching the soft light streaming through the window and illuminating the old furniture. Upon hearing the ring, his heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? Perhaps a wrong number, as sometimes happened. But a small hope began to form in his chest. He got up slowly, each movement marked by age and the weight of solitude. When he finally reached the phone and saw John's name on the screen, his hands trembled. It had been so long since they last spoke. Franklin hardly knew what to say when he answered. "John?" His voice came out hoarse, heavy with emotion. "Dad?" John's voice sounded from the other end, distant, almost formal. "How are you?" Franklin took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of joy and apprehension. "I'm well, son. And you? How are things over there?" "Everything's normal, Dad." There was a long, uncomfortable pause before John continued. "I'm calling to say that maybe I can come by in the next few days." Franklin felt his heart race. A visit? After so long? "That would be wonderful, John. I would really miss you all." "Yeah." John seemed to hesitate, and his voice, despite the words, did not convey the warmth that Franklin so longed to hear. "We'll see what can be done. But, well, I can't promise anything, okay?" Franklin's initial excitement dimmed a bit with that response. There was something in the way John spoke, a distance he couldn't quite understand. Still, Franklin clung to that possibility like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. I understand, son. Just knowing you're thinking of coming already makes me happy. Right. I'll try. We'll talk. Yes, of course. I'll be waiting. John ended the call abruptly, and Franklin stood still for a moment, looking at the phone. The initial joy began to give way to a feeling of discomfort. Something in John's voice unsettled him, but he couldn't pinpoint what. As he placed the phone back on the hook, Franklin turned to the garden he could see from the window. The flowers swayed gently in the wind, but they did not bring the comfort of other days. Instead, he felt enveloped by a sense of uncertainty, as if that connection was the harbinger of something he was not yet ready to face. The day of the visit arrived, and Franklin could barely contain his anxiety. He had spent the entire morning tidying up the house, placing fresh flowers on the dining room table, and preparing a special meal with the few culinary skills he still possessed. It was an effort to try to revive a bit of what the house used to be, full of life and warmth. When the car pulled up to the driveway, his heart raced. John and Diana got out of the car and headed for the door. Franklin opened it before they could knock, smiling widely, but his children responded with tense, almost forced smiles. He couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort at this, but he pushed the thought aside, determined to enjoy their presence. "It's so good to see you both," Franklin said, trying to hide the emotion in his voice. Come in. I've prepared something special for lunch." "Sure, Dad," John replied, entering the house without much ceremony, followed by Diana. She exchanged a quick glance with her brother before moving ahead. The meal was served on a table that seemed larger than Franklin remembered, the emptiness around it amplified by the lack of lively conversation. Franklin tried to initiate a conversation, talking about the garden and how the violets were especially beautiful that year. John and Diana listened, but only responded with monosyllables, exchanging glances that Franklin couldn't decipher. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between them, something he couldn't understand. "The lunch is delicious, Dad," Diana suddenly said, breaking the silence, but her voice was distant, almost automatic. "Ah, thank you, dear. I did what I could with what I had," Franklin replied, trying to keep the conversation light. "How are things in the city? At work?" "All good," John said, looking at his plate instead of at his father. "Nothing new, just the usual hustle." Diana remained silent, fiddling with her food with little interest. Franklin watched the two of them, feeling that there was something unsaid among them. He noticed that John seemed stiffer, as if he were there against his will, and Diana was avoiding his gaze. Franklin's discomfort grew with each passing minute, but he didn't know how to break that silence filled with tension. When they finally finished the meal, Franklin suggested they move to the living room, where they could have coffee and talk more comfortably. John and Diana agreed, but the tension seemed to follow each step they took. "You know, Dad," John began after a long silence in the living room. "We were thinking about the future." Franklin leaned slightly forward, curious. "Yes? What do you have in mind?" Diana and John exchanged glances again before John continued. "We want you to be comfortable, you know. Closer to us. We thought it would be good for you to consider some options, maybe something more practical for all of us." Franklin frowned, trying to understand what was being suggested, but before he could respond, Diana stepped in. "What John means, Dad, is that you don't have to stay here alone. There are alternatives, places where you could have more assistance and company." Her words hung in the air, and Franklin felt a tightness in his chest. This was what he had feared, without even knowing he was afraid. The idea of leaving his home, where every corner held a memory of Evelyn, was unbearable. But he didn't know how to express that without seeming ungrateful. "I need to think about it," Franklin replied, his voice sounding fragile. "That's a lot to absorb at once." John nodded, but there was something in his eyes that Franklin didn't like. It seemed that the decision had already been made for him, not by Franklin. "Of course, Dad," John said, standing up. "Take your time. We just want what's best for you." Diana got up soon after, avoiding Franklin's gaze as if the weight of the conversation had been too much for her. Silence returned to the house as they prepared to leave. Franklin followed them to the door, feeling that something precious was slipping through his fingers, but he didn't know how to hold on. "We'll talk soon," Diana said, giving Franklin a quick kiss on the cheek. "Yeah, we'll be back before long," John added, giving Franklin a light pat on the shoulder before stepping away. Franklin watched the car drive off, feeling a void grow inside him. The garden that once seemed welcoming now felt like an extension of the loneliness he felt. He closed the door and stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, but the sense that something was terribly wrong would not leave him. A few days after the tense visit, John called again. Franklin was in the garden, pulling out some weeds when the phone rang. His heart raced at the sight of John's name on the screen, but the memory of the last visit still weighed heavily on his mind. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," John said, getting straight to the point, without the usual pleasantries. Franklin straightened up, feeling a chill. "Sure, John. What's going on?" "We were thinking," John began, and Franklin noticed the use of the word "we," which clearly included Diana. "We don't think it's safe for you to continue living alone in Springfield. This house, it's too big for you now. And, well, we're worried about your safety." Franklin felt a knot form in his throat. He already knew where this conversation was headed, but even so, he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you suggest?" "Well, Diana and I talked a lot about this, and we think it would be better if you sold the house and moved closer to us. There are good places in the city where you would have all the assistance you need. We could visit you more often, be around in case you need anything." Franklin fell silent for a few moments, absorbing John's words. The house where he and Evelyn had raised their children, where every corner held a precious memory, was now seen as a burden. The thought of selling it, of leaving all of that behind, was almost unbearable. "I don't know, John." Franklin began to speak, but his voice faltered. He knew that, painful as it was, there was a logic to John's suggestion. He was aging, and the loneliness truly was overwhelming at times. But something in the way John spoke, in the quickness with which he brought the subject up, made Franklin feel pressured, as if that decision had already been made without his input. "Dad, I know this is hard," John continued, his voice softer now but still carrying an urgency that Franklin couldn't ignore. "But think about what's best for you. We just want you to be safe and have a more peaceful life." Franklin looked around his garden, at the flowers that Evelyn loved so much, the trees he had carefully planted himself. Everything there told the story of his life, a story he wasn't ready to leave behind. I'll think about it," he finally said, feeling the weight of resignation in his words. "Of course, Dad. Take your time, but know that we're here to help with anything you need." John's voice sounded satisfied, as if he already knew what Franklin's decision would be. When the call ended, Franklin stood in the middle of the garden, feeling more lost than ever. He knew his children thought they were doing what was right. But why did it feel so wrong? The house, the garden, everything he had there was what remained of his life with Evelyn. Selling the house felt like erasing what little remained of those memories. But at the same time, he didn't want to be a burden to John and Diana. They had their own lives, and maybe he was being selfish for clinging so tightly to the house. Confusion filled his mind, and he sat on a bench in the garden, feeling the weight of a decision that seemed impossible to make. The flowers around him swayed gently in the wind, as if trying to comfort him. Franklin closed his eyes and tried to imagine a different life, in a new house, closer to his children. But all he could see was the emptiness that would fill his heart by leaving everything behind. When he went back inside the house, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen lingered with him, like a shadow he couldn't shake off. Franklin took one last look at his home, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. The garden, which had been his refuge, now seemed distant, as if it no longer belonged to him. The furniture was covered with white sheets, and the echo of his footsteps in the empty hallways was the only sound that remained. He silently said goodbye to each room, feeling he was leaving behind not just a house, but a part of himself. John and Diana arrived early that morning to help him with the move. Franklin noticed that both seemed strangely cheerful, an attitude that contrasted with the sadness he felt. As he closed the door for the last time, John approached and placed his hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be good for you, Dad. A new phase, new opportunities," John said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes," Franklin murmured, looking at the key he was now handing to his son. "I hope you're right." The drive to the city was silent. Franklin gazed out the car window, watching the familiar landscape slowly disappear. Each kilometer traveled felt like a farewell to everything he knew. He wondered what life would be like in the new house, but an uncomfortable feeling settled in his chest, something he couldn't explain. When they arrived at the destination, Franklin frowned. It wasn't a house, as he had expected. The building in front of him had gray, lifeless walls, exuding an air of desolation that made his heart tighten. He looked at John, confused. "What is this?" Franklin asked, his voice trembling slightly. John avoided his father's gaze and began walking toward the entrance of the building. "Dad, this is for your own good. Here, you will have all the assistance you need. Diana and I think this is the best option." "Assistance?" Franklin stopped, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. "Is this a nursing home?" Diana, who was next to John, stepped forward, trying to soften the situation. "Dad, you don't need to worry about anything here. They will take care of you. You will have everything you need." Franklin felt a chill run down his spine. The betrayal was clear now, and what he had feared without knowing took shape before his eyes. "You tricked me. I sold my house." His voice broke, and he felt tears sting his eyes. "For this?" John finally looked at his father, but his expression was impassive. "Dad, you need to understand. It's best for all of us. You will adapt. It's just a matter of time." Franklin took a step back, looking around as if searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. He was there, in what felt like a prison disguised as care. The feeling of being a burden, of being discarded, crushed his chest. "No," Franklin murmured, almost powerless. "I won't stay here. I want to go home." "Dad," John replied, his patience wearing thin, "there is no other option. This has already been decided." And with those words, John waved to one of the nursing home staff members who approached. "Welcome, Mr. Miller," the man said with a professional smile but lacking warmth. "We will help you settle in." Franklin looked at John and Diana, searching for any sign of regret, of understanding. But all he saw was the cold determination of someone who had already turned the page. He felt as if the world was collapsing around him, but he had no strength left to fight. Without saying anything more, he followed the staff member inside the building, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a betrayal he never imagined he would suffer. As he walked through the doors of the nursing home, Franklin knew this would be the place where his last days would drag on, far from everything he loved, far from the memories he had tried to preserve. He looked back one last time, but John and Diana had already turned away, ready to continue with their lives, leaving him behind. The first days of Franklin in the nursing home were a whirlwind of emotions and loneliness. The place, which should have been a refuge of comfort, revealed itself to be a silent prison, where time seemed to drag painfully. The corridors were cold, and the constant sound of footsteps and distant voices only heightened the sense of isolation. The few conversations he had with other residents were brief and empty, lacking the warmth he so desperately craved. He spent hours looking out the small window of his room, watching the movement on the street below, but found no solace in the urban landscape. He missed his garden, the flowers he tended with such care. The nursing home was a place devoid of life, devoid of color. Everything there seemed faded, as if time had stolen the vitality of the environment, just as it was doing to him. The promise of visits from John and Diana never materialized. Each passing day, Franklin waited, with a fragile hope, to hear one of his children's voices announcing that they would come to see him. But the phone in his room remained silent, and the expectation soon gave way to a bitter acceptance. He was alone. The reality of his new life hit him like a cold wave, leaving him weaker and weaker. However, amidst the darkness of routine, Franklin found a spark of strength. During one of his walks around the nursing home, he discovered a small old house for sale on a quiet street, not far away. The sight of that house reignited something in his heart, a feeling he thought was lost forever: hope. The house was deteriorated, with cracked walls and an abandoned garden, but Franklin saw in it a refuge, a place where he could start anew, away from the painful memories and the solitude of the nursing home. It was as if that house had been waiting for him, just as he had been waiting for a chance to live again. In the nights that followed, Franklin began to plan in silence. He would use the money he had saved from selling his former house to buy that little property. He could rebuild his life there, away from the coldness of the nursing home, in a place he could once again call home. Every time he thought of the house, he felt his strength renewed. He began to look to the future with determination, imagining himself tending to a new garden, planting flowers like those he and Evelyn had cultivated together. Franklin knew it wouldn't be easy, that he would face many challenges, but the prospect of a different life, a life of his own, kept him moving. One day, while sorting through his few belongings at the nursing home, he prepared to take the first step toward the new life he was planning. Franklin decided that he would speak to the manager of the nursing home about his intention to move out. He knew it would be a difficult conversation, but he was willing to fight for his freedom. The shadow of John and Diana's betrayal still loomed over him, but Franklin would not allow that to define him. He had been strong enough to survive the loss of his wife, and he would be strong enough to face this new phase. The old house was his future, and he would do whatever it took to claim his new life, even if it meant facing yet another battle alone. As he prepared to leave the nursing home and visit the house, Franklin felt a slight smile form on his lips. It was the first genuine smile in a long time. The flame of hope burned again in his heart, and he was determined to keep it alive. Franklin felt like a reborn man as he finally left the nursing home and moved into the small house he had purchased. The house was modest, but it held the promise of freedom and renewal. Each wall, each room, seemed like a blank page ready to be filled with new memories. In the first days, he dedicated himself to restoring the garden, bringing back the color and life that had been so absent in the nursing home. It was during one of those mornings working in the garden that Franklin met his new neighbors, Samantha and Lance. They were a young couple full of energy and enthusiasm, who were immediately enchanted by the man who seemed to find joy in the small things. Samantha brought homemade cookies, and Lance offered to help fix the roof of the house, which was in terrible condition. The bond between them formed quickly, as if fate had planned that friendship. Over time, Samantha and Lance became a constant presence in Franklin's life. They helped him turn the house into a home, and in return, he shared with them stories of his life, from the happy days alongside Evelyn to the bitter betrayals that had led him to the nursing home. The young couple, who had lost their own grandparents, found in Franklin a father figure they had longed for, while Franklin found in them the family he thought he had lost. One day, While exploring the basement of the house to store some tools, Franklin and Lance made an unexpected discovery. Behind a loose wall, they found an old safe. With Lance's help, Franklin managed to open it, and what was inside left them speechless. The safe was filled with riches, ancient coins, jewelry, and documents that seemed valuable. However, Franklin did not let greed take over. Looking at Lance, he said, "These things don't hold as much value as the friendship we've built here. What is all this compared to the loyalty, the kindness you've shown me?" Lance agreed, and together they decided to keep the treasure safe. They knew that the safe could change their lives, but the true treasure lay in the friendship and renewal that Franklin experienced daily. As time passed, Franklin's health began to deteriorate. The years of solitude and the stress from his betrayal had taken their toll. He became more fragile, and his days grew shorter and quieter. But Franklin was no longer alone. Samantha and Lance were always by his side, caring for him with the affection and dedication that his own children had refused to give. Feeling that his time was coming to an end, Franklin began to prepare his legacy. He knew that John and Diana would try to lay claim to anything that remained, motivated by the greed that had led them to betray him. Determined to prevent his biological children from gaining any advantage, Franklin decided to leave the house and the treasure to Lance and Samantha. They were his true family, those who had been with him in the most difficult moments. When Franklin passed away, his funeral was small but filled with genuine love. Lance and Samantha organized everything, and the reading of the will revealed Franklin's decision. John and Diana, who had shown up expecting to profit, were shocked and furious to learn that nothing had been left to them. They tried to contest the will, but to no avail. Franklin's will was foolproof, clearly reflecting his desire for justice. Lance and Samantha, honoring Franklin's memory, decided to use the treasure they found to establish a foundation in his name. The foundation would help young people in vulnerable situations, offering them opportunities that Franklin never had. Franklin's house became the center of the foundation, a symbol of hope and rebirth. Meanwhile, John and Diana were left to face the consequences of their actions. They not only lost the chance to profit from what was left of their father, but also had to confront the truth about their choices and the way they treated the man who gave them everything. In the end, Franklin Miller found peace and justice. His legacy, in the hands of Lance and Samantha, continued to touch lives, perpetuating the values of love, friendship, and loyalty that he had discovered in his final years. And so, Franklin's story did not end in sadness, but in a cycle of hope and renewal, where true love overcame betrayal and greed. Did you enjoy this touching story? If so, don't forget to leave your like to help the channel grow. Want more surprising stories like this? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. And we want to hear from you. Leave your stories, suggestions, and feedback in the comments. They help us bring better content. Until next time.